Hi, everybody. Welcome back. James is going to tell us why he's dressed up. We're here for another one of your questions about work. And if you're here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. My partner, James Cham, is here for a dilemma that we have encountered ourselves and share with others. But thank you, James. And why is it a tie every Tuesday? I forget.
You know, we're still in this weird world where you don't go out that much. And I feel like whenever I have to give a semi-public presentation or a conversation, I should respect it.
Oh, I love that.
And rather than wearing flannel
for us.
Rather than wearing flannel, I will wear a proper tie.
Yes, I know. I'm wearing it because I'm cold. The sun just came out in San Francisco. So I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I'm wearing a collared shirt. So there's that. Let's normalize asking men what they wear.
There we go. There we go.
I probably went into some dangerous territory. All right, what do we want to talk about?
So what prompted this was two things, right? So you'll often say that, we treat founders as our customers, and then you will often say very provocative, interesting things about what it means to have a relationship with a customer. And so there was this time before you were a VC when you ran sort of a relatively big media company, and the way that you thought about advertisers as your customers, sort of fairly big ones, I thought was just really interesting. And to be honest, that relationship between media company and advertiser is like a very fraught one, right? So the relationship between founder and VC is fraught. But I thought there were interesting insights to come out of what do you do when your customers mad at you? And then sort of from my world, coming from software development and consulting, the answer was, I don't know, we say we sorry, we do what they want, right? And I think you have a very different perspective on it. And so
I do have a different perspective on it. I think that even just that question to me it contains within it the core insight, which is it does depend on what kind of business you're in. And so specifically what I mean by that is if you're in the consulting business, roughly your job is to do custom things for customers. And so an unhappy customer probably means you should do something different. If you are in a one-to-many business, like you run a software service with millions of customers or millions of users, and you have an unhappy user, well, then, the question with an unhappy user is maybe a statistical aberration. But what this all gets at is, what is your diagnosis of why the customer is unhappy and what are the principles for it? I definitely do not believe the customer is always right, because nobody's always right. That's like a ludicrous thing to say. That's a thing you say to a retail employee who's being mean to a customer and just needs something simple to say to them. That's just not a good real principle. The real principle to me is, what's the model for how the customer vendor relationship ought to work in that instance? And are you adhering to the model? So I'll give the example, because the most complicated ones are not consulting arrangements where you do tend to default to whatever the customer wants, and not Amazon, where if the customer is unhappy, you send them to tier 3 customer service or something like that. But a business like ours, where we have dozens of customers, each one is really valuable. They talk to each other, so reputation is very valuable. And I think that's true for a lot of businesses that have that kind of mechanic. And so what happened at IGN was we had that, and we had—
What's IGN?
IGN is the media company that I ran that was part of News Corp, which is the largest video games media coverage in the world, has tens of millions of users, blah, blah, blah.
And the reason why I still buy video games, because of some review I'll watch, and I still never play, but someday I will actually play,
play the things. You have Sudoku, but for video games instead of books.
That's right.
The pile accumulating. That's why. So an advertiser in a media company also depends on the content the media company writes about them in a lot of cases. And so the New York Times example of this would be you have an airline that's an advertiser and you write a negative story on the airline industry. What do you do? And of course, the integrity of the product demands that you not change the content based on what the advertiser wants, because then you would lose the core value of the asset. And so what happened in this case was we had a huge campaign. What makes it complicated in that particular business situation is advertisers would spend a lot of money with us to promote a single video game. We would also review that single video game. And oftentimes they'd spend the most on the franchises that were getting tired, video game number 5 in the series, which would get a crappy review. And so this one time, the CMO of said company called me and started reciting, based on your review, not only are we not going to advertise with you, we're not going to advertise with, and he started naming all the sister properties that were part of News Corp. We're not going to advertise in the Wall Street Journal. We're not going to advertise on Fox. And so, of course, my brain is going to like, oh my gosh, I'm about to get a lot of angry phone calls from my peers because of, and then I started thinking, well, what's the model for this relationship? The model for this relationship is that we write the content, we do what we believe, and we do the best we can to accommodate them, communicating with them about it, whatever. And I told him, I was like, the second you threatened me with revenue, you made it impossible for me to do anything for you. Because that's a principle of, we can't change our content. I was like, if you had said like nobody gave us the heads up or, something like that, like we could have figured out some way to communicate it without violating the principle. And so similar thing with founders who are our customers now or angry customers, the first thing you think is, are they angry because of something where like I let down what their expectations were, and therefore I need to make good, in which case then grovel, by all means, grovel, make it right, apologize properly, do a 5 whys and learn about the exercise and correct the thing? Or are they upset because they have some mistaken expectation for how this relationship works? And, same thing with a boss. Like a boss asked you to show up for a 6 a.m. meeting. You are not their indentured servant. You don't have to show up. Don't show up. To communicate with them about it, though, openly and figure out some reasonable path forward. And so it's all about not buying into this idea that power is like an unambiguous one-way street, but that there should be a model for how you work and you push back on it. And I don't know, like you've seen founders be upset about what VCs are supposed to do for them. How does that all land with you?
I mean, obviously the hardest conversation or one of the harder conversations you'll have with someone who you invest in is that conversation in which you have to make it clear that you might not be able to invest in future sort of financings, right? And sometimes that could mean the life or death of a company. And I think for me, in some ways those are hard, but they're also easier because it's a hard conversation. They know it's a hard conversation. Everyone's prepared. And it strikes me that like, as you're talking about this, so often maybe the issue is just understanding the mental model, how you think about the relationship and how you think about your core principles, or not even core principles, but just like how you think about how the whole business should work and how the other side should think about it. Totally. And oftentimes, sort of we were having this conversation about protocols versus APIs just a few minutes ago, right? And like sometimes we don't do the job of reading the documentation to understand the API, or we don't even really understand, so like that equivalent discovery doesn't really happen in business. And then even worse, today in this sort of video conference world, that sort of introspection, it's just much harder to do, right?
Right. You have to do it intentionally. You have to ask and say like, oh, like, do you believe that the way we should work is kind of way? Like another way I could have handled this video game situation, I could have said, well, so do you believe we should change our reviews or have our reviews be influenced by the money you spend on us? And of course, he would have been in a bind then of either saying something obviously unethical, like yes, or saying no, in which case then I win the argument. And so that sort of gets back to one of these principles of curious before furious. And I do think that one of the...
Say that again slowly. What was your phrase?
Curious before furious. And I think I'm not a great practitioner of that. I should try to get better at that. I think that what's really at stake here is defining what the right relationship is between you and a partner, a business partner, and having some clear terms for that. And so if you can do that, then you have an unhappy customer. By the way, as you were talking about VC and the not easy, but the relative ease of handling a hard conversation because it's going to be hard, it strikes me that one of the most difficult kinds of unhappy customer moments is the valuable early customer. Is a service like we invest in some company, they have some early users who are super into it and happy. And then in order to grow, they need to evolve. And their early users who are loyal to them, who are good people, who they know as individuals might be unhappy. And how do you manage that? The principles are exactly the same, but emotionally it's much more difficult because you kind of feel you owe it to these people, and you do, and you should, that has value in the relationship and you should honor that value. And so navigating that becomes a lot trickier than like, no, I'm sorry, sir, we cannot rebook you on the flight to Mars just because your flight to Los Angeles was canceled at the last minute, which feels a little
okay.
easy.
So now this does go back into my overarching theme for 2022, which as you know, is error correction. And then sort of like, it does strike me that like that sort of like getting those two pieces to match and just sort of doing the little maneuvering, that's so valuable and important, especially today. So
yeah, I mean, I
this
think
is really
that
helpful.
if you can frame, we have this mental model, which you've been talking about, which is errors are bad and should be avoided. And of course, errors have something bad in them. Like otherwise they wouldn't be errors. If they, then we would call them
Right.
successes. But if we can frame non-fatal errors as good because of learning, or if even better than that, if we can come up with a narrower definition of these are the kinds of errors we want. And,
Right.
I think about it in investing. It's like if every company we invested in worked out, we'd be horrible investors because it would mean we weren't making enough of the right kind of error, which is the error of trying things that are ambitious and sometimes don't work. And so there is a good kind of error, and I'm not quite sure how to define it, but it relates to this unhappy customer thing in the sense that some customer unhappiness is good. It suggests that the customers have expectations. It suggests you're trying to engage with a different range of customers. It suggests you're active because people are just going to be unhappy sometimes. You just got an unhappy person who's like getting a divorce. It may have nothing to do with you, but they may take it out on you, whatever it is. And so figuring out how do we seek out the good kind of unhappiness, the useful kind of unhappiness and manage it is, I think, a variant of that error correction question.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
All right. Anything else before we wrap?
No, I think that was great.
All right. Find us with answers to lots of past questions at thisisnotadvice.work. And just as a reminder, if you're watching this for the first time, the reason we call it This Is Not Advice is we're not giving you prescriptions. We don't know how you should live your life. We're giving you our own experiences so you can write your own autobiography instead of us doing it. And to be continued. Thank you, James.
Great.